The dust cloud on the horizon told Tessa Langley everything she needed to know about mercy in the New Mexico territory. Left behind by the very people who had promised safe passage, she pressed her hand to her swelling belly and watched the wagon train disappear into the shimmering heat. Her husband's fever had claimed him 3 days ago, and now superstition would claim her too. The settlers whispered that death followed pregnant widows like shadows follow the sun. So they had given her 1 day's water and prayers she didn't want, then rolled on without looking back. Now, as the sun reached its merciless peak and buzzards began their patient circles overhead, Tessa wondered if this barren creek bed would become her grave. But what those God-fearing folks didn't know was that some women are forged in fire, not broken by it, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Will Tessa survive long enough to discover that her greatest trial might actually be her greatest blessing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound that saved Tessa's life wasn't the thunder of hooves or the crack of a rifle. It was the gentle whinny of a mare calling to her foal. Reese Dalton had been tracking that sound for the better part of an hour, following his prize Arabian who had slipped her tether in the pre-dawn darkness. What he found instead, crumpled beside the dry creek bed like a discarded prayer, was a woman whose stubborn refusal to surrender had impressed even the buzzards into respectful silence. Reese had seen death before. He'd held it in his arms, whispered promises to it that he couldn't keep, and buried it under the cottonwood tree behind his ranch house. But this woman, this stranger with sun-cracked lips and eyes that burned with the kind of fire that refuses to be extinguished, she wasn't ready to meet her maker just yet. He dismounted with the careful grace of a man who had learned that sudden movements in this territory often preceded sudden endings. The woman's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly, and Reese felt something twist in his chest, a pain so familiar it had become part of his daily breathing. "Easy now," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used with spooked horses. "I'm not here to harm you." Tessa's eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, tracked his every movement. She'd heard those words before, from men who'd proven them false with their next breath. But something in this stranger's manner, the way he approached her with hands visible, the way he kept his distance until she showed she wouldn't bolt, made her lower her guard just enough to whisper, "Water." The single word contained multitudes, desperation, hope, and a pride that refused to beg even in the face of death. Reese uncapped his canteen and held it out, watching as she drank with the measured control of someone who understood that salvation often came in small portions. As she drank, Reese studied her properly. Even in her bedraggled state, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of better days. Her dress, though travel-worn and patched, had been well made once. Her hands, though work-roughened, bore the tan line of a wedding ring recently removed. Most telling of all was the way she positioned herself. Even while drinking, she maintained a posture that suggested she was prepared to defend something precious. "Name's Reese Dalton," he said when she'd finished drinking. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Medical supplies, food, a bed that doesn't come with scorpions for company." Tessa considered this offer with the wariness of someone who had learned that charity often came with strings attached. "And what would you want in return, Mr. Dalton?" The question hung in the air between them like heat shimmer. Reese had asked himself the same thing from the moment he'd spotted her. The sensible answer would be nothing. Drop her at the town doctor's, perhaps leave enough money for her care, and ride away with his conscience clear. But looking at her now, seeing the way she held herself despite everything she'd endured, he found himself remembering another woman who had possessed that same unbreakable spirit. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said finally, and meant it. The ride to the Dalton Ranch passed in contemplative silence. Tessa rode behind Reese on his sturdy gelding, her arms loosely circling his waist, her body swaying with the horses. rhythm in a way that suggested she was no stranger to the saddle. The landscape around them gradually shifted from harsh desert scrub to rolling grassland, and then to the sight that made Tessa's breath catch in her throat. The Dalton Ranch spread before them like a vision from a more hopeful dream. Adobe buildings, with red tile roofs clustered around a central courtyard where a fountain played music with its gentle splash. Corrals held horses that looked like they'd been crafted from moonlight and wind, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Gardens bursting with vegetables and herbs suggested a prosperity that went beyond mere survival. But it was the details that told the real story. Wind chimes that sang soft melodies from every porch, flower boxes bright with blooms that served no practical purpose except beauty, and an overall sense of care that spoke of a place where someone had tried very hard to build something lasting. "Old Pete," Reese called as they approached the main house. "Miguel, we've got company." Two men emerged from the barn, one grizzled and bent with age, the other young and eager with the kind of energy that suggested he still believed the world held more good than bad. Both moved with the easy familiarity of men who had worked together long enough to communicate in glances and gesture. Old Pete, despite his name, moved with surprising spryness as he helped Tessa down from the horse. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in her condition, but his voice remained carefully neutral. "Ma'am, looks like you've had yourself quite a journey." Miguel, barely out of his teens but already showing the broad shoulders of a man who earned his living, with his hands, rushed forward with the kind of helpful enthusiasm that reminded Tessa painfully of her late husband. "Should I fetch Dr. Morrison from town, Senor Dalton?" "Not yet," Reese said, his eyes never leaving Tessa's face. "Let's get her settled first, see what she needs." What Tessa needed, it turned out, was more than she'd dared hope for in the dark. Hours beside the creek bed. The guest room Reese showed her to was simple but immaculately clean, with windows that caught the late afternoon light and a view of the mountains that reminded her why she'd wanted to come west in the first place. The bed, when she finally allowed herself to sink onto it, felt like the softest luxury after weeks of sleeping on hard ground. But it was the small kindnesses that nearly undid her. The pitcher of fresh water with a basin and clean towels, the simple blue dress laid out on the chair, sized, she realized, for a woman in her condition, and the tray of food that appeared shortly after, carrying the kind of nourishing soup that suggested someone understood exactly what her body needed to begin healing. As evening settled over the ranch, Tessa found herself seated in the kitchen, watching Reese move around the space with the easy competence of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. His hands, she noticed, were gentle despite their obvious strength. The hands of someone who worked with horses, who understood that force was never the first solution to any problem. "You don't have to tell me," he said, without turning from the stove where he was preparing tea. "About what happened, I mean. About how you came to be out there." But Tessa found that she wanted to tell him. Maybe it was the way he moved, without hurry, or the way he'd helped her without asking for her story first, or simply the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying her grief alone. Whatever the reason, she found herself speaking into the comfortable silence of the kitchen. "Jacob, my husband, he took sick about 2 weeks out of Santa Fe." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around. The warm cup Reese placed before her. "Fever, the kind that burns a man up from the inside. I nursed him as best I could, but—" She paused, staring into the tea, as if it might contain answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. The other families, they started getting nervous when he didn't get better, started talking about bad luck, about how sickness follows some folks like a curse. When Jacob died, they said prayers and dug him a grave, but I could see it in their eyes. They blamed me somehow. Reese settled into the chair across from her, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to let her maintain her dignity. He said nothing, but his attention was complete, the kind of listening that invited honesty. "When they found out about the baby," Tessa continued, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. That's when the whispers really started. Said it wasn't natural, a woman carrying life right alongside death. Said bad luck would follow the whole. Train if they kept me with them. The words came easier now, as if speaking them in this warm kitchen somehow robbed them of their power to hurt her. So they gave me Jacob's portion of supplies, well, most of it anyway, and told me they'd send help from the next town. I knew they wouldn't, but I took their charity anyway. Figured I'd rather die honest than live with their pity. Reese reached across the table and covered her hands with one of his own. The gesture was so natural, so unassuming, that Tessa didn't even think to pull away. You're not going to die, he said simply. Not here, not on my watch. Something in his voice, a certainty that brooked no argument, made Tessa look up and really see him for the first time. He was handsome in the way of men who worked outdoors, his face weathered but strong, his dark hair touched with just enough silver to suggest wisdom earned rather than simply accumulated. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. Brown, like rich earth, but shadowed with a grief that mirrored her own. "You've lost someone too," she said. It wasn't a question. Reese's hand tightened briefly on hers before he pulled back, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small object wrapped in faded silk. When he unwrapped it, Tessa saw a miniature portrait of a woman with laughing eyes and a smile that suggested she'd found joy in simple things. "Catherine," he said, his voice soft with memory. "We were married 3 years. She died in childbirth, her and the baby both. That was 5 years ago come October." The shared grief hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Tessa understood now why he'd stopped for her, why he'd brought her home instead of simply delivering her to the nearest town. He recognized something in her that others had missed, not bad luck or a burden to be endured, but a fellow traveler on the long road of loss. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "So am I," he replied. "For Jacob, for what those people did to you, for all of it." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. Through the kitchen window, Tessa could see old Pete making his evening rounds, checking gates and water troughs with the methodical care of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. Miguel's laughter drifted from the bunkhouse, where he was apparently sharing stories with the other hands. It was, Tessa realized, the sound of a place where people belonged, where they were valued not for what they could provide or how little trouble they caused, but simply for being themselves. It had been so long since she'd been part of something like that, she'd almost forgotten such places existed. "The baby," Reese said eventually. "When are you due?" 3 months. Maybe a little less. Tessa's hand moved to her belly again, a gesture that was becoming as natural as breathing. "I should probably see that doctor you mentioned. Make sure everything's—" She paused, suddenly overwhelmed by all the things that could go wrong, all the ways this fragile hope could be snatched away. "We'll go to town tomorrow," Reese said firmly. "Dr. Morrison's a good man, been delivering babies in this territory longer than anyone. You and the little one will be fine." The certainty in his voice was like a warm blanket on a cold night, not because Tessa entirely believed him, but because someone finally cared enough to offer reassurance instead of warnings about all the ways she might fail. As Reese showed her back to her room, Tessa caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was still hollow-cheeked and sunburned, still wore the haunted expression of someone who had looked death in the face and somehow walked away. But there was something else there now, a spark of possibility that hadn't been there when she'd watched that dust cloud disappear into the horizon. "Thank you," she said as they reached her door, "for everything. I know you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Reese interrupted gently. "Some things you do because they're right, not because they're easy or convenient, or because someone's keeping score." As Tessa settled into the comfortable bed, she found herself thinking about second chances and the strange ways they sometimes arrived. Outside her window, the night sounds of the ranch created a symphony of contentment. horses shifting in their stalls, the distant call of an owl, the soft whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. For the first time in weeks, Tessa Langley fell asleep without wondering if she'd wake up to see another sunrise. And in the room down the hall, Rhys Dalton sat by his window, holding Catherine's portrait and wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop living in the past and start believing in the possibility of a different kind of future. The sharp pain that woke Tessa from her first peaceful sleep in weeks felt like a warning from her own body, a reminder that safety was still a fragile thing, easily shattered by forces beyond her control. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the familiar tightness that had been coming and going for days, but this time it lingered, accompanied by a dampness that made her heart race with fear. "Rhys," she called out, her voice barely above, a whisper, but somehow carrying the urgent weight of genuine alarm. Within moments she heard his boots on the wooden floor, quick but controlled, the sound of a man who understood that emergencies required swift action without panic. He appeared. In her doorway, hair tousled from sleep but eyes immediately alert. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," Tessa said, her hand still pressed protectively over her unborn child. "There's bleeding, and the pain, it's different from before." Rhys was already moving, his mind clearly shifting into the kind of focused efficiency that came from years of dealing with livestock emergencies, where minutes could mean the difference between life and death. "Old Pete," he called toward the bunkhouse, "saddle 2 horses, gentle ones. We're riding to town." The journey to town that morning felt both endless and terrifyingly brief. Tessa rode side-saddle on Rhys's calmest mare, her body swaying with each careful step while Rhys led them at a pace that balanced urgency with the need to avoid jarring her condition. Every mile brought fresh waves of cramping, and with them the growing certainty that this pregnancy, this last piece of Jacob she carried, might slip away just as everything else had. The town of Esperanza sat in a valley between red rock mesas, its adobe buildings clustered around a central plaza that had seen better days. As they approached, Tessa became increasingly aware of the curious stares following their progress down the dusty main street. A pregnant woman arriving with Rhys Dalton was apparently noteworthy enough to draw people to their windows and doorways. Dr. Morrison's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building near the church, its whitewashed walls and red cross painted above the door, marking it as clearly as any sign. The doctor himself met them at the door, a compact man in his 60s with steel-grey hair and the kind of steady hands that inspired confidence even in crisis. "Rhys," he said by way of greeting, then turned his attention immediately to Tessa. "Ma'am, let's get you inside and see what we're dealing with." The examination room was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean, with medical instruments arranged on white cloths and the sharp smell of carbolic acid that spoke of a man who understood the importance of hygiene in frontier medicine. Dr. Morrison's examination was thorough and professional, his questions direct but not unkind. "How far along are you?" he asked as he checked her pulse and temperature. "About 6 months, maybe a little more." "And this bleeding, when did it start?" "This morning, but I've been having pains off and on for the past week." Dr. Morrison's expression grew more serious as he continued his examination, his hands gentle but probing as he assessed her condition. When he was finished, he helped her sit up, his face wearing the carefully neutral expression of a medical professional delivering news that could go either way. "Well," Rhys asked from his position near the window, where he'd been pretending to study the street while clearly hanging on every word. "The baby's still alive," Dr. Morrison said, and Tessa felt a rush of relief so powerful it left her dizzy. "Heart sounds strong, positioning seems normal, but you're showing signs of what we call placental disturbance. Basically, your body's under too much stress, and it's affecting the pregnancy." He sat down heavily in his chair, fixing Tessa with the kind of look that suggested he was about to say things she didn't want to hear. "Mrs. Langley," Tessa supplied. "Tessa Langley." "Mrs. Langley, I'm going to be direct with you because sugar-coating medical facts has never saved a baby or a mother. You need complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks, probably more. No riding, no lifting, no stress of any kind. Your body needs time to settle, and this baby needs time to get stronger before it decides to make its appearance. The words hit Tessa like a physical blow. Complete bed rest meant complete dependence, and complete dependence meant imposing on Reese's kindness, far beyond anything she had a right to expect. Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I don't have anywhere she'll stay. At the ranch, Reese said firmly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. For as long as she needs. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. Good. The Dalton place is probably the best spot in the territory for a woman in her condition. Clean air, good food, and peace and quiet. He turned back to Tessa. I'll want to see you again in a week, sooner if the bleeding returns or the pains get worse. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Morrison handed Reese a small leather bag. Laudanum for the pain, but use it sparingly. And some iron tablets. She's anemic from stress and poor nutrition. Make sure she gets plenty of red meat and green vegetables. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their trip to town. But the silence felt different now, heavier with implication and unspoken understanding. Tessa found herself acutely aware of her position. Completely dependent on a man she'd known for less than 2 days, carrying a child whose very existence had made her a pariah among people who should have protected her. But she was also aware of something else, the way Reese had spoken up in the doctor's office, claiming responsibility for her care without hesitation or apparent resentment. It was the kind of gesture that spoke to character in ways that mere words could never convey. They were halfway back to the ranch when they encountered the first real test of that character. A group of townspeople had gathered near the old stone bridge that marked the boundary between public land and the Dalton property. 3 men and 2 women, all wearing the kind of expressions that suggested they had appointed themselves as guardians of public morality. Reese Dalton, called out the leader, a thin man with a preacher's collar and the kind of pinched face that suggested he found fault with most of creation. We need to have words with you. Reese brought their horses to a stop, his posture remaining relaxed, but Tessa could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Reverend Patterson, what can I do for you? It's what you're doing that concerns us. Patterson replied, his eyes flicking disapprovingly toward Tessa. Taking in a woman of questionable reputation, flaunting proper moral standards in front of the whole community. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and potentially destructive. Tessa felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, but before she could speak, Reese was already responding. I found a woman in distress and offered Christian charity, he said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made Patterson take an involuntary step backward. Last I checked, that was still considered a virtue in these parts. Christian charity is one thing, interjected one of the women, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. But housing an unmarried woman in your home, especially one in her condition, it creates talk, Reese, the kind of talk that reflects poorly on all of us. Then maybe, Reese said, dismounting and helping Tessa down with elaborate courtesy, you should talk about something else. Mrs. Langley is a widow who lost her husband to fever and was abandoned by people who should have known better. She's under my protection now, and anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally. The emphasis he placed on the word personally carried implications that made the men in the group shift uncomfortably. Reese Dalton might be known for his horses and his generosity, but he was also known as a man who could handle himself when push came to shove. This isn't over, Patterson said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Reese replied firmly. It's over, and it's not starting again. Mrs. Langley is under my roof and under my protection, and that's the end of the discussion. As they rode away from the confrontation, Tessa found herself struggling with emotions she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also something deeper, a recognition that Rhys had just committed himself publicly to her welfare in a way that would have consequences for both of them. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Rhys replied, echoing his words from the night before. "Some things are right, and some things are wrong. Protecting a woman who's been through what you've been through, that's right. Everything else is just noise." That evening, as Tessa settled into what would become her home for the foreseeable future, she found herself thinking about the strange turns that life could take. A week ago, she had been dying beside a creek bed, convinced that her story was ending in failure and abandonment. Now she was lying in a comfortable bed, listening to the peaceful sounds of a working ranch, carrying a child that might actually have a chance at life. But she was also thinking about the look in Rhys's eyes when he defended her to those townspeople. Not just protective, but something more personal. Something that suggested her presence in his life was already becoming more than simple charity. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as she drifted towards sleep with her hand resting on her belly, where the baby had finally settled into peaceful stillness, Tessa found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. The wooden recipe box had been gathering dust on the kitchen shelf for 5 years, its carved lid depicting roses and hummingbirds that Catherine Dalton had once traced with her finger while planning meals for a family she'd never lived to feed. When old Pete carried it down and set it before Tessa with the reverence of a man handling something sacred, she understood immediately that she was being offered more than just cooking instructions. Mrs. Catherine, she was mighty particular about her cooking, Pete said, his weathered hands gentle as he opened the box to reveal dozens of cards written in a delicate feminine script. Always said food was how a woman showed her family she loved them, even when words weren't enough. Tessa traced one of the recipe cards with her fingertip, reading the careful notations about cooking times and ingredient substitutions. At the bottom of a card for apple cake, someone had written, "Rhys's favorite, always burns the edges slightly in a different hand," as if the writer had discovered this preference through trial and error. "She wouldn't mind," Pete continued, settling into the chair across from her. "Mrs. Catherine, I mean. She'd want these recipes used by someone who'd appreciate them proper-like." The old cowhand had become her unexpected companion during the long days of enforced bed rest. While Rhys managed the ranch operations and Miguel tended the horses, Pete appointed himself as her guardian and conversation partner, bringing his mending to her room, or on good days, helping her settle in the kitchen where she could rest, while still feeling useful. "Tell me about her," Tessa said, selecting a recipe for beef stew that looked simple enough for someone still regaining her strength. "About Catherine." Pete's eyes took on the distant look of someone sifting through memories like prospector's sand, looking for the nuggets worth keeping. "She was sunshine in human form, if you don't mind me saying so. Could make this whole place feel alive just by walking through it. Had a laugh that could charm birds from trees, and a temper that could make grown men think twice about tracking mud on her clean floors." As Pete talked, Tessa began to understand the depth of loss that had shaped Rhys's life for the past 5 years. Catherine hadn't just been his wife, she'd been the heart of this ranch, the person who'd transformed a successful business operation into a true home. Her absence explained the careful way Rhys moved through the house, as if he were afraid of disturbing ghosts. "She wanted children something fierce," Pete continued, his voice growing softer. "Used to talk about filling this place with the sound of little feet and laughter. When she finally got pregnant, you'd have thought she'd struck gold. Rhys, he was so proud he could barely sit still. The unspoken tragedy hung between them like morning mist. But Tessa found she needed to hear it all, to understand the full scope of what Rhys had endured and why her presence here might mean more to him than simple charity. "What happened?" she asked gently. "Baby came early, and there were complications. Doc Morrison did everything he could, but—" Pete shook his head. lost them both in the same hour. Reese didn't speak for near 2 months after that, just worked from dawn to dusk like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The revelation explained so much about Reese's behavior, his immediate response to finding her, his insistence on providing protection, his careful attention to her medical needs. In helping her, he was perhaps healing some part of himself that had been broken beyond repair 5 years ago. Over the following days, as Tessa gradually regained her strength, she found herself settling into the rhythms of ranch life with surprising ease. The morning routine began with Pete bringing her coffee and a report on the night's events, which horses had foaled, what repairs were needed, whether the weather looked favorable for the day's work. Miguel, initially shy around the pregnant stranger, gradually warmed to her presence, especially after she'd helped him write a letter to his sweetheart back in Santa Fe. His face had lit up with grateful wonder as she'd guided him through the formal phrases required for courtship correspondence, and from that moment forward, he'd treated her with the protective courtesy due to an honored aunt. "Senora Tessa," he said one afternoon as she sat in the kitchen working on mending, "would you like to see the horses? Senor Reese, he has some of the finest animals in the territory." The suggestion had come from Reese himself, she suspected, a carefully orchestrated way to give her gentle exercise without making her feel like an invalid. As they walked slowly toward the corrals, Miguel's enthusiasm for his work became apparent. In the way he spoke about each animal's bloodline and temperament. "That one there, the grey with the white star, that's Luna. She's expecting her first foal next month. And the big black stallion, that's Thunder. Senor Reese brought him all, the way from Kentucky. But it was the gentle bay mare in the nearest corral that caught Tessa's attention. Something in the horse's intelligent eyes reminded her of her own situation, watchful, wary, but not without hope. "What about her?" Tessa asked. Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "That's Esperanza. She belonged to Mrs. Catherine. Nobody's ridden her since the accident. Senor Reese, he can't bring himself to sell her, but he can't bear to ride her either." As if summoned by their conversation, Reese appeared from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands dusty from whatever task had occupied his afternoon. When he saw Tessa at the corral fence, his expression softened in a way that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Feeling stronger today?" he asked, joining them at the fence. "Much better. Miguel was showing me your horses. They're beautiful." Reese's eyes followed her gaze to Esperanza, and Tessa saw a flicker of old pain cross his features. Catherine loved that mare. Used to say they understood each other without words. "Maybe," Tessa said carefully, "when I'm fully recovered I could help exercise her. It seems a shame for such a beautiful animal to go unused." The suggestion hung between them, loaded with implications neither quite ready to acknowledge. Allowing her to ride Catherine's horse would be more than practical. It would be a symbol of acceptance, of moving forward rather than preserving the past in amber. "We'll see," Reese said finally, but his tone suggested the idea wasn't unwelcome. That evening, as Tessa worked in the kitchen preparing dinner from one of Catherine's recipes, she found herself thinking about the strange alchemy of grief and healing. The beef stew simmering on the stove filled the house with rich, welcoming aromas that seemed to awaken something that had been sleeping in these rooms for too long. When Reese came in from his evening rounds, he stopped in the kitchen doorway, as if struck by sudden memory. "Smells like," he began, then trailed off. "Like home?" Tessa suggested gently. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "She would have liked you. Catherine, I mean, you have the same way of making everything feel possible." The compliment, unexpected and deeply felt, hit Tessa with surprising force. She turned back to the stove to hide her sudden tears, stirring the stew with more attention than it required. "I hope so," she said softly. "I hope she wouldn't mind me being here, using her things." "She'd insist on it," Rhys said with growing certainty. "Catherine never could stand waste, especially the waste of good things sitting unused. She'd want her. Recipes feeding people, her horse getting exercise, her house filled with life again." As they sat down to dinner together, the first meal Tessa had prepared since arriving at the ranch, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer simply rescuer and rescued, host and grateful guest. They were becoming something more complex and fragile. Two broken people, discovering that their individual wounds might somehow fit together to create something whole. The baby kicked gently as she ate, as if responding to the rich food and peaceful atmosphere. For the first time since Jacob's death, Tessa allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival, a future where her child might grow up knowing safety and love, where she herself might find purpose beyond simply enduring. It was a dangerous hope, she knew. Hope had disappointed her before, but as she watched Rhys savor each bite of the meal she'd prepared from his late wife's recipe, she found herself thinking that perhaps some risks were worth taking after all. The wooden cradle arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried in Miguel's strong young arms like a precious offering. He'd been working on it in secret for weeks, using scraps of cedar from fence repairs and whatever spare time he could steal between his regular duties. The craftsmanship was simple but honest, no fancy carving or elaborate decoration, just clean lines and careful joints that spoke of patience and genuine affection. "For the little one," Miguel said shyly, setting it down in Tessa's room with the careful reverence of someone handling something sacred. "I know it's not much, but I thought, well, every baby should have a proper place to sleep." Tessa ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the love that had been carved into every surface. The cradle was exactly the right size for a newborn, with gentle curves that would rock a fussing infant to sleep, and high sides that would keep an active baby safe. It was, she realized, the first tangible acknowledgement that her child would actually be born, actually survive, actually need the things that babies required. "Miguel, it's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." The young man's face flushed with pleasure, but he waved away her gratitude with characteristic modesty. "It was nothing, Senora. Besides, Senor Rhys, he provided the wood and tools. I just put them together." That evening, Rhys stood in her doorway studying the cradle with an expression she couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice carried undertones of memory and loss that made her heart ache for him. "He did good work," Rhys said simply. Catherine would have loved it. The mention of his late wife had become less painful over the past weeks, Tessa noticed. Where once the name had seemed to cause him physical pain, now it carried the gentle sadness of a wound that was finally beginning to heal. "Rhys," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about what you said about exercising Esperanza. I'm feeling much stronger now, and Dr. Morrison said gentle activity would be good for me." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, seeing the conflict play out in his expression. She understood the dilemma, allowing her to ride Catherine's horse would be another step away from the shrine he'd built to his grief, another acknowledgement that life was moving forward whether he was ready or not. "I suppose," he said finally, "it would be good for both of you. Esperanza needs the exercise, and you need to stay strong for—" He gestured toward her belly, where the baby had grown noticeably larger over the past month. The next morning dawned, clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that made everything seem possible. Rhys had saddled Esperanza with his own hands, adjusting the stirrups and checking every buckle twice before leading the mare to the mounting block he'd constructed specially for Tessa's use. "Easy, girl," he murmured to the horse, his voice carrying the same gentle authority Tessa had noticed in her own interactions with him. "You remember how this works?" Esperanza stood perfectly still as Tessa mounted, her ears pricked forward with intelligent attention. When Tessa settled into the saddle and gathered the reins, the mare's response was immediate and eager. She had missed this partnership, this purpose. They started with a gentle walk around the corral, Reese walking alongside with one hand on Esperanza's bridle. But as horse and rider reacquainted themselves with each other's rhythms, he gradually released his protective hold and stepped back. "She remembers," he said with something like wonder in his voice. "Look at her. She remembers what it means to carry someone who understands horses." It was true. Esperanza moved with renewed grace and purpose, her step lighter and her head held, higher than it had been in months. And Tessa, despite her awkwardness from pregnancy and months of limited activity, found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of horseback riding with surprising ease. "I used to ride every day back in Missouri," she said, as they made their second circuit of the corral. "My father said a woman who couldn't manage a horse couldn't manage much of anything." "Smart man," Reese replied, but his attention was focused on her posture, her hand position, the subtle communications passing between horse and rider. What he saw apparently pleased him, because when they finished their circuit, he opened the corral gate. "Feel up to a real ride?" he asked. "Nothing strenuous, just down to the creek and back." The ride to the creek became a daily ritual, a time when Tessa could escape the confines of careful invalidism and feel like herself again. Reese usually rode alongside her on Thunder, maintaining the careful pace that allowed for conversation while keeping watch for any signs that she was overexerting herself. It was during one of these rides that he began teaching her about the ranch. Business in earnest, not just the romantic aspects of horse breeding that visitors noticed, but the practical realities of bloodlines and profit margins, feed costs and market prices. "Most people think breeding horses is about finding the prettiest animals and hoping for the best," he said, as they paused to let the horses drink from the clear stream. "But it's really about understanding genetics, about matching strengths to weaknesses and planning 3 generations ahead." Tessa found herself genuinely interested in the complexities he described. The careful record-keeping, the patient observation of bloodlines, the delicate balance between taking risks and protecting investments. It was like a vast puzzle where every piece had to fit perfectly for the picture to emerge. "How did you learn all this?" she asked. "Trial and error mostly. My father was a cattleman, good with beef stock but never understood horses. When I decided to focus on breeding instead of ranching, he thought I'd lost my mind." Reese's expression grew thoughtful. "Took me 5 years to prove him wrong, another 5 to make real money at it. And Catherine, was she part of the business?" "She was the business," Reese said without hesitation, "had an eye for bloodlines that put mine to shame, and a way with difficult horses that bordered on magical. Half the breeding decisions we made were hers, though she never got credit for them." The admission revealed another layer of his loss, not just a beloved wife and unborn child, but a true partner in the work that defined his life. Tessa began to understand why the ranch had felt somehow diminished despite its obvious prosperity. Without Catherine's input and enthusiasm, Reese had been operating at half capacity for 5 years. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Reese surprised her with a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "What would you have done?" he asked. "If Jacob had lived, if you'd made it to California?" Tessa considered the question seriously, thinking back to dreams that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Jacob wanted to farm. He had this idea about growing oranges, said California soil was so rich you could plant a stick and harvest furniture. She smiled at the memory of her husband's optimism, finding that she could think of him now without the crushing weight of guilt and grief that had dominated her thoughts for so long. "I don't think I would have been happy just keeping house and waiting for oranges to grow. I would have wanted to be part of building something, creating something that mattered." "Like what?" "I don't know exactly. Something that used both my hands and my mind. Something that made a real difference in the world." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch, the peace broken only by the distant sound of Miguel's guitar and the gentle lowing of cattle settling for the night. When Reese finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that made Tessa's pulse quicken. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what you said, about wanting to be part of building something. If you're interested, and only if you're interested, I could use a partner in this business. Someone with fresh eyes and good instincts." The offer hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous water. Accepting would mean committing to staying, to building a life here that went far beyond gratitude or temporary refuge. It would mean trusting in a future that included both of them, trusting that the growing warmth between them was real and sustainable. "I'm interested," Tessa said quietly, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly, where their shared future was growing stronger every day. When Reese reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his own, the gesture felt like a promise, not just of business partnership, but of something deeper and more lasting. Something that honored the past while embracing the possibility of a different kind of love, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than the desperate passion of youth. As they sat holding hands in the gathering darkness, Tessa felt the baby kick against her palm, as if the little one approved of the direction their lives were taking. For the first time since Jacob's death, she allowed herself to believe that her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. A letter that would change everything arrived on a morning when the desert air carried the promise of rain. Reese had ridden to town for supplies and returned with more than flour and coffee beans. He carried himself differently, with the careful posture of a man who had made a decision that both terrified and exhilarated him. Tessa was in the garden when he found her, tending to the tomato plants that old Pete had insisted would grow despite the challenging climate. Her pregnancy was showing more prominently now, a gentle rounding that made her movements careful but graceful. When she looked up at his approach, the smile that lit her face made something tight in Reese's chest finally loosen. "How was town?" she asked, straightening slowly and brushing soil from her hands. Instead of answering directly, Reese withdrew a folded paper from his vest pocket. The formal stationery and elegant script immediately caught Tessa's attention. This was not ordinary. "Correspondence. I've been thinking about what we discussed," he said, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "About partnership, about building something together. And I realized that if we're going to do this properly, there are certain formalities that need to be addressed." Tessa's heart began beating faster as she recognized the nature of the document he was offering her. A marriage proposal written in Reese's careful hand, formal enough to satisfy social conventions, but personal enough to reflect the unique circumstances of their relationship. "Tessa Langley," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not from desperation or convenience, but because I have come to believe that some partnerships are blessed by Providence, and ours is one of them." The words continued, describing his commitment to providing for her and her child, his respect for her strength and intelligence, and his hope that together they might build something worthy of the love they had both lost and the love they were beginning to discover. When she finished reading, Tessa looked up to find Reese watching her with an expression of vulnerability she had never seen before. This powerful, self-assured man was offering her his heart and his future, and he was genuinely uncertain of her response. "The baby," she said carefully, needing to address the practical realities that complicated their situation. "People will talk, will assume. Let them assume," Reese replied firmly. "I'm asking to be this child's father in every way that matters. Name, protection, inheritance, everything a child deserves. Jacob may have given this baby life, but I want to give it a future." The generosity of the offer overwhelmed her. In accepting marriage to Reese, her child would gain not just legitimacy, but genuine love and opportunity. The baby would grow up as a Dalton, heir to a prosperous ranch and a respected name. "And if I say yes?" Tessa asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "What kind of marriage would it be? Partnership? Convenience? Or—" She let the question hang between them, afraid to voice the hope that had been growing in her heart over the past weeks, afraid to admit that what had begun as gratitude had deepened into something much more dangerous and precious. Rhys stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "It would be whatever we choose to make it," he said. "I won't lie to you. I loved Catherine with everything I had, but she's gone, and I'm still here. And somehow you've made me remember that. Being alive means more than just not being dead." He reached out to touch her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. "I can't promise you the passionate romance of first love, Tessa, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and whatever capacity for love this old heart still has to give." The kiss that followed was soft and tentative, a question rather than a demand. When Tessa kissed him back, it was her answer, not just to his proposal, but to the possibility of a future neither of them had dared imagine. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes to all of it." The wedding preparations that followed were deliberately simple, reflecting both their circumstances and their shared preference for substance over spectacle. Dr. Morrison agreed to perform the ceremony, having witnessed enough frontier hardships to appreciate the practical wisdom of their union. Old Pete and Miguel would serve as witnesses, and the ceremony would take place in the ranch's garden, surrounded by the life they had built together. But even simple weddings required certain formalities, and it was while addressing these details that they encountered their first serious obstacle. Harrison Wade, the land speculator who had been circling the smaller ranches like a buzzard, waiting for weakness, had apparently been watching the Dalton spread with particular interest. "He came by yesterday while you were in town," Old Pete reported as they gathered in the kitchen to discuss wedding plans, asking questions about boundaries, water rights, whether you might be interested in selling. Rhys's expression darkened. "What did you tell him?" "Same thing I always tell land grabbers, that you're not interested and he can take his business elsewhere." But he didn't seem inclined to take no for an answer. Started talking about how a man's circumstances can change, how marriage and family responsibilities might make a fellow reconsider his priorities. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Wade was clearly hoping that Rhys's new responsibilities would make him more amenable to selling, perhaps even applying pressure to force such a decision. "What do you know about this man?" Tessa asked, her instincts warning her that Wade represented more than simple business competition. "Nothing good," Rhys replied grimly. "He's been buying up smaller spreads for the past year, usually from folks who couldn't afford to say no. Word is, he's working for railroad interests, trying to assemble a corridor for a new line coming through the territory." The implications were serious. Railroad development could bring prosperity to some, but it often came at the expense of established ranchers who found themselves displaced by progress they couldn't control. "He can want all he likes," Rhys continued with forced confidence. "This ranch isn't for sale, not to him or anyone else. We've got water rights going back 20 years. Clear title to every acre, and no debts that would force our hand." But Tessa noticed the way his jaw tightened as he spoke, the unconscious gesture of a man who wasn't as certain as his words suggested. She was beginning to understand that their happiness had painted a target on their backs. Wade saw their wedding as an opportunity to exploit rather than celebrate. That evening, as they sat on the porch discussing final wedding arrangements, Tessa brought up the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Are we being foolish?" she asked. "Getting married now, when there are people who want to use it against us?" Rhys was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. When he finally answered, his voice carried the certainty of a man who had, faced uncertainty before and survived. Maybe, he said honestly, but I've learned that there's never a perfect time for important decisions. You can wait for ideal circumstances forever and wake up one day to realize you've waited your life away. He turned to face her fully, his expression intense in the moonlight. I want to marry you, Tessa, not because it's convenient or safe, or because other people approve, but because life is uncertain and love is rare, and when you find both in the same place, you don't let fear talk you out of it. The conviction in his voice settled something restless in Tessa's heart. He was right. They could spend their lives trying to anticipate every threat, every complication, every reason why their happiness might not last. Or they could choose to build something worth defending and trust in their ability to protect it together. Then let's get married, she said simply. Let's build our partnership and let Harrison Wade and anyone else who doesn't like it find something more productive to worry about. As they kissed goodnight on the threshold of her room, Tessa felt the baby kick strongly, as if the little one approved of their decision. In 3 days, she would become Mrs. Reese Dalton, and her child would have a father whose love was freely given, rather than grudgingly accepted. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. A thought that filled her with more hope than she had dared embrace in longer than she could remember. The surveyor's map that old Pete discovered, hidden beneath a loose board in the abandoned Henderson cabin, told a story that made Reese's blood run cold. Spread across the kitchen table under the light of 3 oil lamps, the detailed drawings revealed the true scope of Harrison Wade's ambitions, and the Dalton Ranch sat squarely in the center of his planned railroad corridor. Found it this morning. When I was checking the boundary markers, Pete explained, his weathered finger tracing the proposed rail line. Henderson Place has been empty since they pulled out last month. But somebody's been using it for meetings. Coffee cups still warm, papers scattered like they left in a hurry. Tessa leaned over the map, her 7-month pregnant form making the movement awkward, but her mind sharp as she studied the implications. Red lines marked existing property boundaries, while bold black strokes showed the intended path of the railroad. Ranch after ranch had been marked with notations, acquired, negotiating, or in the case of 3 properties including theirs, priority targets. How many ranches has he already bought out? She asked, though the evidence before her suggested she wouldn't like the answer. 7 families in the past year, Reese replied grimly. I thought they were just struggling with drought and cattle. Prices, but looking at this, he gestured toward the map. Wade's been orchestrating a campaign, picking them off one by one. Miguel appeared in the doorway, his young face grave with the weight of urgent news. Senor Dalton, there are riders approaching, at least 6 men, maybe more. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Wade's people had clearly been watching the ranch, waiting for an opportunity to apply pressure. With the wedding scheduled for tomorrow, and Tessa's pregnancy nearing its final weeks, he probably calculated that Reese would be more amenable to negotiation. Get the rifles, Reese instructed Pete, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that reminded everyone present that he hadn't built this ranch by backing down from fights. Miguel, ride to the Morrison place and ask the doctor to stay close tomorrow. Tell him there might be trouble. I'm not going anywhere, Tessa said firmly, recognizing the protective impulse behind Reese's planning. This is my home too, and that map affects our future as much as yours. The riders arrived with the deliberate swagger of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than reason. Wade himself led the group, a well-dressed man in his 50s whose soft hands and calculating eyes marked him as someone who profited from other people's labor without getting dirt under his own fingernails. Dalton, he called out as they approached the house, his tone carrying false joviality that fooled no one. Heard congratulations are in order. Wedding tomorrow, I understand. Reese stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready, flanked by Pete and 2 other ranch hands who had materialized from the barn with the silent efficiency of men accustomed to trouble. Wade, You're on private property without invitation. Now, no need for hostility, Wade replied, dismounting with theatrical calm. I'm here as a neighbor, offering my best wishes for your upcoming nuptials, and perhaps discussing a business proposition that could benefit us all. The man's eyes found Tessa as she appeared in the doorway, and his expression shifted subtly, taking in her obvious pregnancy, cataloguing it as another pressure point he could exploit. Mrs. Langley, isn't it? Soon to be Mrs. Dalton. Remarkable how quickly circumstances can change a person's priorities. My priorities are quite clear, Mr. Wade, Tessa replied with ice in her voice. They involve building a life with my husband and raising our child on land that belongs to us. Wade's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his eyes. Admirable sentiments, truly, but I wonder if you've considered all the challenges that face a growing family in this territory. Railroad development brings progress, prosperity, opportunity for investment that could secure your child's future far better than scraping by on a cattle ranch. Our ranch is prospering just fine, Reese interjected, but Wade continued as if he hadn't spoken. For now, perhaps. But what happens when the railroad goes through anyway, just north of your property? When the trains scare your cattle and the noise drives away your breeding stock? When property values for ranches double, while yours remains landlocked and worthless? The threat was elegantly delivered, but unmistakable. Wade was telling them that resistance was futile. The railroad was coming whether they cooperated or not, and their only choice was whether to profit from the inevitable or be destroyed by it. What exactly are you proposing? Tessa asked, though she suspected she already knew. Wade's smile widened, sensing an opening. A partnership. You sell me the ranch at fair market value plus 20%, enough to buy a substantial spread. Somewhere more suitable for family life. I provide guaranteed employment for your husband, overseeing railroad construction through the territory. Regular salary, steady work, a future you can count on. The offer was carefully crafted to appeal to every fear they might harbor about their uncertain future. Regular income instead of the boom and bust cycles of ranching. Steady employment, rather than the constant struggle against weather and market forces. Security for their unborn child, but it was also a surrender of everything they had worked to build, not just the physical property, but the independence and self-determination that made their partnership meaningful. And if we decline your generous offer? Reese asked, though his tone suggested he already knew that answer too. Wade's expression never changed, but his voice carried a subtle shift toward coldness. Then you'll face the same challenges as any business that stands in the way of progress. Difficult winters, cattle diseases, market fluctuations that favor larger operations over smaller ones. The territory can be unforgiving to those who don't adapt to changing circumstances. The veiled threats hung in the air like gun smoke. Wade was promising a campaign of harassment and sabotage designed to make their lives so difficult that selling would seem like the only rational choice. We'll need time to consider, Tessa said before Reese could respond, with what she suspected would be a more direct refusal. Of course, Wade replied smoothly, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely, and I'd hate to see a young family suffer unnecessarily due to stubbornness. After Wade and his men departed, the three of them stood in the kitchen, studying the surveyor's map with new understanding. What had seemed like random pressure from a land speculator was revealed as part of a larger, more sophisticated campaign to acquire their property by any means necessary. He's not going to give up, Pete observed grimly. Men like that, they see resistance as just another obstacle to overcome. Then we need to be ready, Reese replied, his jaw set with determination. For whatever he throws at us. Tessa placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements as if the little one sensed the tension surrounding them. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Reese Dalton. But tonight, she was a woman facing the reality that their happiness had made them. Targets. There's something else, she said quietly, a thought occurring to her as she studied the map. If Wade's been this systematic about acquiring properties, there must be other ranchers who've been approached, people who said no and might be facing the same pressure we are. Reese looked up from the map, understanding immediately where her thoughts were leading. You're thinking about organizing resistance. I'm thinking about survival, Tessa corrected. Wade's counting on picking us off one by one, the way he has been. But if we stand together, present a united front. The idea had merit, Pete acknowledged, with a thoughtful nod. Strength in numbers. Make it too costly for him to pressure all of us at once. As they planned their wedding day that would now also serve as the beginning of their fight for their home, Tessa felt the baby settle into stillness, as if the little one was gathering strength for the challenges ahead. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family, and perhaps if they were smart and strong and lucky, they wouldn't have to face it alone. The surveyor's map lay spread between them like a declaration of war, but Tessa found herself oddly comforted by its presence. At least now they knew what they were up against. And knowing the enemy, she reflected, was the first step toward defeating him. The telegram arrived on their wedding morning, carried by a dust-covered rider who had pushed his horse hard through the night to deliver it. Tessa was in her room, carefully arranging the simple white dress that old Pete had somehow procured from town, when Miguel's urgent knock interrupted her preparations. "Senora," he called through the door, his voice tight with concern. "There is a message for you from Santa Fe." Tessa's hands stilled on the pearl buttons of her dress. She knew no one in Santa Fe, had no reason to expect correspondence from that direction, but something in Miguel's tone suggested this was not a simple congratulatory telegram from well-wishers. She opened the door to find the young man holding a yellow telegraph paper with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for explosives. The rider, he said it was urgent, that someone paid extra to have it delivered today, no matter what. With trembling fingers, Tessa unfolded the telegram and read the words that would shatter the careful peace she had built. "Tessa, stop, Jacob. Alive, stop, recovered from fever. Stop searching for you. Stop arriving Esperanza tomorrow. Stop your husband, Jacob Langley. Stop." The paper fluttered from her nerveless fingers as the implications crashed over her like a flash flood. Jacob was alive. Her husband, her legal husband, had survived the fever that had supposedly killed him, had been searching for her all this time, and was now coming to reclaim the wife he believed was his. Miguel's sharp intake of breath told her he had read the telegram as it fell. "Dios mío," he whispered. "What does this mean?" Before Tessa could answer, Reese appeared in the hallway, drawn by their voices. He took one look at her face, white with shock and growing panic, and immediately moved. To her side, "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes alert for danger. Miguel wordlessly handed him the telegram. Tessa watched Reese's face as he read, seeing the careful control that settled over his features like armor. When he finished, he folded the paper precisely and looked directly into her eyes. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "all of us." In the kitchen, with old Pete summoned from his morning chores and Miguel standing guard at the door, they faced the reality that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The wedding dress Tessa still wore seemed to mock her now, white silk and pearl buttons for a ceremony that might constitute bigamy. Could it be a mistake? Pete asked hopefully. Wrong Jacob Langley, maybe? But Tessa was already shaking her head. He mentioned the fever, mentioned searching for me, and the timing. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to scatter like startled cattle. The wagon train leader. He said Jacob was dead. We buried him. I saw the grave. But did you see the body? Reese asked gently, his lawyer's mind already working through the possibilities. The question hit her like a physical blow. She had been too distraught, too overwhelmed by grief and her own growing illness, to insist on viewing Jacob's body before burial. The other women had handled the preparation, had told her it was better to remember him as he was. At the time, their kindness had seemed like mercy. No, she whispered. "I was sick myself, and they said it was better." The terrible possibility began to take shape in her mind. What if Jacob had fallen into the kind of fever-induced coma that could be mistaken for death? What if he had awakened after his burial, weak and confused, but alive? The thought of him clawing his way out of a shallow grave, searching desperately for a wife who had already moved on, made her stomach lurch with guilt and horror. "There's something else," Reese said grimly, producing another piece of paper from his pocket. "This came with the other telegram. Wade's been busy." The second message was brief, but devastating. "Understand, Mrs. Langley's situation has changed. Stop revised offer stands. Stop deadline tomorrow. Stop H. Wade." The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Wade had somehow learned about Jacob's survival and was using the information to maximum advantage, calculating that the legal and emotional chaos would make them desperate enough to accept his terms. "How could he know?" Tessa asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Telegraph operators talk," Pete said darkly. "And Wade's got enough money to buy information when he needs it." The full scope of their predicament settled over them like a suffocating blanket. If Jacob was truly alive and could prove his identity, then Tessa's marriage to Reese would be invalid. Worse, their relationship could be construed as adultery, carrying legal and social consequences that could destroy both their reputations and Reese's business. But the deeper wound was emotional. Tessa had grieved for Jacob, had slowly and painfully learned to love again, had built a new life on the foundation of his death. Now she was being asked to resurrect a marriage she had mourned and buried, to abandon the partnership that had given her purpose and hope. "What do we do?" Miguel asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their crisis meeting. Through the kitchen window, they could see a lone rider approaching at a steady pace, not the aggressive swagger of Wade's men, but the measured gait of someone who had traveled far and was finally nearing his destination. Tessa's hand went instinctively to her throat, where Jacob's wedding ring had once hung on a chain, before she'd finally removed it weeks ago. "He's early," she whispered. The man who dismounted in their courtyard bore little resemblance to the robust farmer who had left Missouri months ago with dreams of California oranges. This Jacob was gaunt from illness and hard travel, his hair prematurely grey and his clothes hanging loose on a frame that spoke of recent hardship. But his eyes, when they found Tessa through the kitchen window, blazed with the kind of desperate love that had sustained him through whatever trials he had endured. "Tessa!" he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with the weight of months of searching, hoping, and refusing to give up. "Tessa! I'm here. I found you." The joy in his voice was genuine and heartbreaking. Here was a man who had literally risen from the dead to reclaim his wife, who had searched across a hostile territory because he couldn't imagine life without her. The fact that she had already imagined life without him, had begun building that life with another man, was a betrayal that would destroy him if he learned of it. Reese placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch conveying support without possessiveness. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "I'll stand by you. The baby will always have a home here, and so will you, no matter what name you choose to carry." The generosity of the offer, given in the face of losing everything he had hoped for, nearly undid her completely, but there was no time for tears or extended farewells. Jacob was already approaching the front door, his step quickening as he anticipated the reunion he had dreamed of during his long recovery and longer search. "Mrs. Dalton," Pete said formally, using her married name for what might be the last time, "what do you want us to tell him?" Tessa looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, at the people who had become her family, at the man who had taught her that love could be both practical and profound. Then she looked through the window at Jacob, who was reaching for the door with the eager anticipation of a man who believed his greatest trial was finally over. "Tell him," she said, straightening her shoulders and summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, "that his wife is coming to speak with him." As she walked toward the front door in her wedding dress, Tessa felt the baby kick strongly, as if the little one sensed the momentous choice that lay ahead. In a few moments, she would face the husband she had mourned, the man whose legal claim to her life was unassailable, but whose place in her heart had been filled by another. Whatever happened next would require wisdom, courage, and a kind of grace that she could only hope to find when she looked into Jacob's eyes and tried to explain how loving one man had taught her to love another. The telegram lay forgotten on the kitchen table, its yellow paper already beginning to curl in the morning. Heat, a small piece of technology that had traveled hundreds of miles to prove that sometimes the dead don't stay buried, and that the past has a way of arriving at exactly the wrong moment to claim what it believes it's owed. The Colt revolver had belonged to Reese's father, a man who had believed that some problems could only be solved with decisive action and unwavering resolve. As Reese lifted the weapon from its place of honor above the fireplace, the weight of it in his hands felt like an inheritance of responsibility. Not just the cold metal and careful engineering, but the understanding that protecting what mattered sometimes required a willingness to face consequences that couldn't be undone. Outside in the courtyard, voices were rising as three men struggled to find a path through an impossible situation. Jacob's initial joy at finding his wife alive had given way to confusion and growing anger as the truth of her circumstances became clear. His voice, weakened by months of illness but strengthened by righteous indignation, carried clearly through the windows. "You're telling me my wife is married to another man? That she's carrying his child?" The pain in Jacob's words was raw and immediate, the sound of a man watching his world collapse for the second time in 6 months. Tessa's voice, when she responded, carried the careful control of someone walking a tightrope over an abyss. "Jacob, please try to understand. We thought you were dead. I mourned you. I buried you. When I met Reese, I was a widow trying to survive, but you're not a widow." Jacob's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm here, I'm alive, I never stopped looking for you. Doesn't that mean anything?" From his position by the window, Reese could see the three of them standing in a rough triangle, each holding their ground, but none able to find a position that didn't require someone else's sacrifice. Jacob looked exactly like what he was. A man who had endured months of hardship and traveled hundreds of miles to reclaim his life, only to discover that life had moved on without him. Tessa stood between them, her pregnancy making her position both more complicated and more vulnerable. The child she carried represented hope and future to Reese, but to Jacob, it must seem like evidence of betrayal, proof that his wife had not just moved on, but had created new life with his replacement. "The baby," Jacob was saying, his voice hollow with hurt. "How could you? We tried for 2 years to have a child, and now—" "The baby is mine to protect," Reese interjected, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "Whatever happened before, whatever claims anyone has, this child will have a father who wants it and a home where it's welcome." The words were carefully chosen, but Jacob heard the challenge beneath them. "You're talking about my wife, stranger, about the woman I married before God and witnesses, the woman who wore my ring and promised to love me until death." "Death did part you," Reese replied steadily. "She kept that promise. She loved you until she believed you were dead, and then she learned to live again. There's no shame in that for either of you." Old Pete appeared at Reese's elbow, his weathered face grave with concern. "Boss, we got riders coming. Wade's men, looks like, and they're not coming social-like." The timing was catastrophic. Wade had clearly calculated that the emotional chaos of Jacob's return would provide the perfect opportunity to apply maximum pressure. With Tessa's legal status in question and Reese distracted by personal crisis, the ranch's defenses were at their weakest. "How many?" Reese asked, checking the cylinder of his father's Colt. 8, maybe 10, all armed, moving like they mean business. Through the window, Reese could see that the confrontation in the courtyard had paused as all three participants became aware of the approaching threat. Jacob's hand had moved instinctively to his own weapon, a practical farmer's pistol, worn with the easy familiarity of a man who had learned to protect himself during hard travels. "Trouble?" he asked, his personal grievances temporarily set aside in favor of more immediate concerns. "Land grabber named Wade," Reese explained tersely. "Been trying to force us off our property for months. Picked today to make his final offer." Jacob's expression hardened with understanding. Whatever else divided them, he recognized the threat that outside forces posed to everything Tessa had built here. Bastards always pick their moments, don't they? The grudging respect in his voice suggested that beneath the hurt and anger, Jacob was still the decent man Tessa had married, someone who could put aside personal pain when real danger threatened people he cared about. Wade's party came into view as they crested the low hill overlooking the ranch, their horses fresh, and their formation organized like a military unit rather than a business delegation. Wade himself rode at the center, his expensive clothes and confident posture marking him as a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and superior force. "They're not here to negotiate," Pete observed grimly. "That's a raiding party if I ever saw one." Miguel came running from the barn, his young face flushed with urgency. "Senor Dalton, they have men positioned on the North Ridge too. We are surrounded." The tactical situation was clear. Wade had planned this as a final confrontation, using Jacob's unexpected arrival to catch them off guard and divided. With Tessa's pregnancy limiting her mobility and the ranch hands outnumbered, their options were severely limited. "Jacob," Reese said, making a decision that went against every possessive instinct he possessed, "whatever's between us can wait. Right now, Tessa needs protection, and this ranch needs defending. Are you willing to stand with us?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Jacob had every right to walk away, to let the complications of Tessa's new life resolve themselves. Without his involvement, he could take his wife and leave, abandoning the ranch and everyone in it to Wade's mercies. Instead, Jacob checked his pistol and took a position that gave him a clear field of fire toward the approaching riders. "Tessa chose this place," he said simply. "That makes it worth defending." The gesture was more than tactical. It was acknowledgement that whatever claims he might have on Tessa's past, he respected the choices she had made and the life she had built. It was, Reese realized, exactly the kind of quiet heroism that had made Tessa fall in love with Jacob in the first place. Wade's voice carried across the courtyard as his men took positions around the ranch buildings. "Dalton, I believe we have some business to conclude. The lady's change in circumstances seems to have created some complications with your property arrangements." The calculated cruelty of using Tessa's situation as leverage was typical of Wade's approach, finding weakness and exploiting it without regard for the human cost. But he had miscalculated in one crucial respect. He had assumed that personal conflict would weaken their resolve, when instead it had forced them to clarify what truly mattered. "Tessa," Reese called without taking his eyes off Wade's position. "Get inside. Whatever happens here, you and the baby stay safe." But Tessa was already shaking her head, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through abandonment and near death in the desert. "This is my home too. I'm not hiding while other people decide my future." Her words seemed to focus. Something in both men, a recognition that this woman had already proven herself stronger than either of them had given her credit for. She had survived abandonment, near death, social ostracism, and now the return of a past she had thought buried. If she was willing to stand and fight for the life she had chosen, then they had no choice but to stand with her. The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, and Tessa's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The gesture reminded them all of what was truly at stake. Not just property or pride or legal technicalities, but the future of an innocent child who deserved to grow up safe and loved. "Wade's made one mistake," Jacob said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching threat. "He thinks this is about land and money and legal complications. But it's not." "What's it about?" Reese asked. Jacob looked at Tessa, then at Reese, his expression carrying a kind of painful clarity. "It's about family, about protecting the people you love, even when love gets complicated." As Wade's men completed their encirclement of the ranch, the three of them stood together, not as rivals competing for the same prize, but as people united in defense of something larger than their individual desires. The baby Tessa carried represented hope and continuity, but it also represented vulnerability that had to be protected. Wade dismounted and began walking toward them with the confident swagger of a man who believed he held all the cards. What he didn't understand was that sometimes the strongest position isn't about having the most advantages. It's about being willing to risk everything for something that can't be bought, sold, or negotiated away. The Colt revolver in Reese's hand felt like more than a weapon now. It felt like a symbol of the choice between surrender and resistance, between accepting what others demanded and fighting for what you believed was right. His father had carried this gun through his own battles, had passed it down with the understanding that some things were worth the ultimate sacrifice. As Wade approached calling terms for surrender, Reese felt the weight of that inheritance and knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just who owned this land, but what kind of legacy they would leave for the child who was even now growing stronger in Tessa's womb. The climax was coming, and they would meet it together. Three people whose lives had become entangled in ways none of them had planned, but who had discovered that love, in all its complicated forms, was worth defending against any threat. The ranch bell that Catherine Dalton had installed to call the hands in for meals now rang with desperate urgency, its bronze voice carrying across the valley with a message that transcended words. Old Pete pulled the rope with methodical determination, sending the alarm to every neighboring ranch within 5 miles, a call for help that invoked the unwritten code of frontier survival. Wade's confident advance faltered as the bells pealing echoed off the surrounding hills. He had planned this confrontation carefully, timing it to catch the Dalton ranch at its most vulnerable moment, but he hadn't counted on the power of that simple bronze bell to transform a private dispute into a community crisis. "Shut that damn noise up!" Wade shouted to his men, but none of them were positioned to reach the bell tower without exposing themselves to rifle fire from the ranch house. The first labor pain hit Tessa like a lightning strike, doubling her over just as she was moving toward better cover. The timing was catastrophic. Her body had apparently decided that this moment of maximum danger was the perfect time to bring new life into the world. "Reese!" she gasped, clutching the porch railing as another contraction seized her. "The baby, it's incoming." Jacob was beside her instantly, his medical knowledge from years of treating sick livestock translating into human care. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked, his personal anguish temporarily set aside in favor of immediate necessity. "This is only the second one," Tessa managed through gritted teeth. "But they're strong." From the bell tower, Pete's voice carried over the chaos. "Riders coming from the east. Looks like the Morrison boys and maybe the Hendersons." The cavalry was arriving, but slowly. Wade's men were already in position and armed for battle, while the neighboring ranchers were responding to an alarm bell, not a military engagement. The next few minutes would determine whether help arrived in time to matter. "Miguel," Reese called, "get Dr. Morrison's bag from the house, and boil water, lots of it." Wade apparently recognized that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The longer this confrontation continued, the more witnesses would arrive, and the harder it would be to claim that whatever happened was simply a legitimate business dispute gone wrong. "Last chance, Dalton," he shouted. "My offer expires when those riders get here. After that, you deal with whatever consequences follow." The threat was clear. If Wade couldn't buy the ranch, he was prepared to take it by force and worry about legal justification later. In the chaos of a shooting fight, evidence could be lost, witnesses could be silenced, and possession could become 9/10 of the law. Another contraction hit Tessa, stronger than the last, and she knew with certainty that this baby was not going to wait for a more convenient time. "Jacob," she whispered, "I need to get inside." But before anyone could move to help her, Wade made his decision. With a sharp gesture to his men, he initiated the attack he had hoped to avoid, apparently calculating that it was better to fight on his own terms than to face a growing number of armed neighbors who might not appreciate his methods. The first shot came from the north ridge, a rifle bullet that splinged off the porch railing inches from where Tessa stood. The message was clear. Wade's men were not aiming to kill, at least not initially. They were trying to force surrender through intimidation and superior firepower. Reese's response with his father's Colt was immediate and precise, placing a shot close enough to the ridge shooter to send him diving for better cover. "That's fair warning," he called out. "Next one won't be." Jacob had managed to get Tessa inside the house, where she could labor in relative safety, while the men handled the immediate threat. But even through the thick adobe walls, the sound of gunfire was terrifying, and each shot reminded her that the people she cared about were risking their lives to protect her and her unborn child. "How you doing?" Jacob asked, helping her settle onto the bed in what had been intended as her wedding chamber. "Scared," she admitted, her honesty surprising them both. "Not of the baby. That feels right somehow. But this fight, these men who want to destroy everything we've built." Another contraction cut off her words, and Jacob found himself timing the intervals with the same focused attention he had once brought to difficult carvings on their Missouri farm. "They're getting closer." "Together," he observed. "This baby's serious about making an appearance." Outside, the sound of more gunfire was punctuated by Pete's triumphant shout. "The Morrisons are here, and they brought half the county with them." The bell tower's bronze voice had done its work. What Wade had intended as a private intimidation was becoming a public confrontation, with witnesses arriving from every direction. The unwritten law of the frontier was simple. When a neighbor's bell rang in distress, you came running and you came armed. Through the window, Tessa could see riders streaming into the valley from multiple directions, their dust clouds marking the approach of men who had dropped everything to answer the call for help. The sight filled her with fierce pride in the community they had become part of, in the network of mutual support that made survival possible in this harsh land. But the immediate danger was far from over. Wade's men were trapped now, surrounded by an increasingly hostile crowd, which made them more dangerous rather than less. Cornered animals fought with desperate ferocity, and cornered men were often no different. As another contraction peaked, Tessa felt the baby shift position, preparing for its entrance into a world that was proving to be as dramatic and uncertain as any frontier tale. The little one would be born into chaos, but also into love, surrounded by people willing to fight for its right to exist and thrive. The bell continued its bronze song, calling the community together in defense of something that transcended property lines or legal disputes, the right of decent people to build lives based on love and mutual respect rather than fear and exploitation. The baby's first cry pierced the morning air with a clarity that cut through gunfire and shouting, like a bell announcing the arrival of something sacred. In that moment, every person in the valley, friend and enemy alike, seemed to pause, struck by the primal power of new life declaring its presence in a world suddenly too complex for simple violence. Inside the ranch house, Jacob cradled the tiny, squalling infant with the wonder of a man witnessing a miracle. "It's a girl," he announced to Tessa, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "She's perfect. Strong lungs, all her fingers and toes, fighting mad about being born." Into all this chaos, Tessa, exhausted but triumphant, reached for her daughter with hands that trembled from more than physical fatigue. The baby was indeed perfect, red-faced and furious, with a shock of dark hair that suggested she would inherit her mother's coloring. When Tessa held her for the first time, the child's cries gradually subsided into the kind of peaceful breathing that spoke of complete trust in her new world. Outside, the effect of that first cry was transformational. Wade's men, who had been maintaining aggressive positions around the ranch, seemed suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of continuing a gunfight in the presence of a newborn. The moral calculus had shifted in ways that even hardened mercenaries couldn't ignore. Dr. Morrison, who had arrived with the second wave of neighbors, called out from his position near the corrals. "Wade, you've got a choice to make here. This has gone from business dispute to something else entirely. Think carefully about what happens next." Wade himself seemed frozen by indecision. His original plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Pressure a vulnerable ranch owner into selling by any means necessary. But the arrival of a dozen armed neighbors, combined with the birth of a child during the confrontation, had created a situation that defied easy resolution. Reese appeared in the bedroom doorway, his father's Colt still in his hand, but pointed toward the floor. When he saw Tessa holding the baby, his expression softened with an emotion that transcended the legal complexities of their situation. "She's beautiful," he said simply, and the reverence in his voice suggested that whatever else remained unresolved, his commitment to protecting this child was absolute. Jacob looked between Tessa and Reese, seeing something in their interaction that forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. This wasn't a woman who had been seduced away from her marriage. This was a woman who had found genuine love after believing herself widowed, who had built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Tessa," he said quietly, his decision crystallizing as he watched her with the baby, "I need to tell you something. The fever, I remember more now than I did when I first woke up. I remember the peace I felt, the sense that I was ready to let go. When I thought I was dying, my last thought wasn't about fighting to stay alive. It was about hoping you'd find happiness without me." The admission hung in the air like a benediction. Jacob had traveled hundreds of miles and endured tremendous hardship to find his wife. But now that he had found her, he was choosing to honor what she had become rather than trying to reclaim what she had been. Outside, Wade's voice cut through the morning air with the sharp edge of desperation. "This isn't over. Railroad's coming through whether you like it or not, and when it does, every one of you will regret standing against progress." But even as he made the threat, his men were already beginning to pull back. The moral authority had shifted decisively against them, and continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except to make Wade's position worse with local law enforcement. Dr. Morrison seized the moment to broker a resolution. "Wade, you and your men ride out now, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding that got out of hand. But if you come back here making threats, you'll answer to every rancher in this valley." The baby chose that moment to cry again, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, as if adding her own voice to the demand that Wade and his men depart. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the confrontation together, releasing the tension that had built to dangerous levels. Within minutes, Wade's party was mounting up and riding away, their retreat marked by angry muttering and dark promises of future consequences, but they were leaving, and that was what mattered. The immediate threat was over. As the neighbors gathered in the courtyard to celebrate the baby's birth and the successful defense of the ranch, Jacob made his final decision. Taking Reese aside, he spoke in low tones that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "She chose you," he said simply. "Not because I was dead, but because you became the partner she needed. I won't stand in the way of that." The generosity of the gesture was profound, but Reese recognized the sacrifice it represented. "Jacob, No," Jacob interrupted. "Some things are bigger than what any one person wants. That little girl deserves to grow up in a home built on love, not legal obligations. And Tessa deserves a husband who chose her every day, not one who's trying to resurrect a marriage that ended when the fever took me. The baby's contented murmuring from inside the house seemed to approve of the decision, as if she understood that her future was being secured by men who put her welfare above their own desires. The crisis was over, the threat was gone, and a new life had begun in the midst of chaos. Proof that sometimes the most important victories come not from fighting for what you think you're owed, but from protecting what truly matters. 6 months later, the family photograph captured more than anyone had dared hope for when the first autumn leaves began falling around the Dalton ranch. Tessa sat in the center, radiant with the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world, baby Catherine Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her arms. Reese stood behind them, his hand resting protectively on Tessa's shoulder, while Jacob occupied a place of honor to her left, not as a rival or interloper, but as beloved family. The photograph had been Dr. Morrison's idea, part of his ongoing campaign to document the changing character of their frontier community. 20 years from now, he had insisted, while adjusting his camera equipment, people need to see how civilized folks handle complicated situations, how love finds a way to grow even in rocky soil. The rocky soil metaphor had proven more literal than poetic. The ranch that had seemed so prosperous when Tessa first arrived had revealed underlying challenges that took all their combined efforts to address. Wade's railroad project had indeed materialized, but not in the form he had envisioned. The territorial government, alerted by the community action against his intimidation tactics, had investigated his methods and found enough irregularities to void his development contracts. The actual railroad, when it finally came through 2 valleys over, brought prosperity rather than displacement. Reese's horses were now in demand throughout the territory, with buyers traveling from as far as Denver to see his breeding stock. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Wade's threatened destruction had become the foundation of their greatest success. Jacob had proven himself as invaluable as Reese had hoped, but not in ways anyone had anticipated. His experience with crop management translated perfectly to pasture development, and his natural teaching ability made him the ideal person to train young Miguel in the finer points of animal husbandry. More importantly, his presence had given baby Catherine something precious, proof that families could be built on love rather than blood, that belonging was earned through commitment rather than accident of birth. "She's got her mother's stubborn streak," Jacob observed as they watched the baby refuse to nap despite obvious exhaustion, "and her father's determination to do everything on her own terms." The casual use of father when referring to Reese had taken months to feel natural, but now it reflected the reality they had all accepted. Reese was Catherine's father in every way that mattered, the man who walked the floors with her during teething, who sang lullabies in a voice better suited to horses than infants, who planned her future with the same careful attention he gave to his breeding programs. Jacob had found his own path to contentment as ranch foreman and unofficial uncle, the kind of beloved family member whose wisdom and steady presence enriched everyone's life. His quarters in the renovated bunkhouse suited him perfectly, close enough to be part of daily life, independent enough to maintain his dignity. The legal resolution of their complicated situation had required the services of a territorial judge with more wisdom than precedent to guide him. Judge Harrison, no relation to their former nemesis, had listened to their unusual request with the kind of careful attention that suggested he understood the stakes involved. "What you're asking," he had told them during the hearing, "is for the law to recognize what the heart already knows, that love creates obligations that transcend legal technicalities, and that the welfare of a child matters more than the convenience of adults." The custody arrangement they had worked out was unprecedented but practical. Reese would be Catherine's legal father and guardian, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Jacob would be listed as her godfather and would maintain permanent rights to visit and participate in major decisions. Tessa would have final authority over all matters concerning her daughter's upbringing. More importantly, they had created a family structure that honored everyone's contributions while prioritizing Catherine's need for stability and love. The little girl would grow up knowing that she was wanted by multiple adults, that her arrival had brought people together rather than driving them apart. The ranch itself had become a model for the kind of progressive thinking that was beginning to define their territory. Visitors often commented on the unusual harmony of the household, the way responsibilities were shared without regard for traditional gender roles, the obvious prosperity that came from combining different strengths toward common goals. Tessa had thrown herself into the business side of ranch operations with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. Her natural gift for numbers and planning, combined with her fresh perspective on marketing and customer relations, had increased their profits by 30% in the first year. She was particularly proud of the breeding record system she had developed, which tracked bloodlines and performance data with scientific precision. "You know what I think?" she said as they studied the latest batch of photographs Dr. Morrison had developed. "I think we're proof that some stories don't end the way they're supposed to. They end the way they need to." Reese reached over to trace the outline of her face in the photograph, marveling at how different she looked from the desperate woman he had found beside the creek bed. This Tessa radiated confidence and purpose, the kind of deep satisfaction that came from building something meaningful. "What we've built here," he said thoughtfully, "it's not what any of us planned, but it's exactly what we needed." Jacob nodded, agreement from his position by the window where he was watching Miguel work with the young horses in the corral. Sometimes the best gifts come disguised as disasters. If Tessa hadn't been abandoned by that wagon train, if I hadn't gotten sick, if Wade hadn't tried to steal the ranch, we might never have found each other, Tessa finished, shifting the baby to her other arm. All of us, I mean. This family that nobody could have designed, but somehow fits together perfectly. As evening settled over the ranch, they gathered on the front porch that had become their family's favorite meeting place. Catherine gurgled contentedly in her father's arms, while her parents and uncle planned the next day's work, discussed the weather prospects, and shared the kind of comfortable conversation that marked a successful household. The desert sky painted itself in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had welcomed Tessa to this place when she was a different person with different dreams. Looking at that sky now, holding her daughter while surrounded by the men who had chosen to love them both, she marveled at the strange alchemy that had transformed abandonment into belonging, loss into abundance, fear into hope. The photograph on the mantel captured a moment, but the life they were building together would last for generations, proof that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about passion conquering all, but about ordinary people choosing to build extraordinary families through patience, wisdom, and the revolutionary decision to put love ahead of everything else.